This is the moment every grad student fears. Your committee asks a question and you don't immediately know the answer. Your mind goes blank, or you realize you never considered that particular angle, or you see a flaw in your own logic that you somehow missed, or they're asking something that's just outside the scope of what you studied. What you do in this moment matters enormously, not just for answering that particular question, but for everything that comes after. How you handle not knowing determines whether it's a minor stumble you recover from quickly or whether it shakes your confidence and affects the rest of your performance. Let me explain why this moment feels so threatening and then give you specific techniques for handling it. When you don't know an answer, your threat response intensifies. Your amygdala was already monitoring the situation, already somewhat activated by the fact that you're being evaluated. Now it registers something more acute. We're failing. We're being exposed as inadequate. Danger. Your stress response amplifies. More cortisol gets released. More adrenaline. Even less blood flow stays in your prefrontal cortex. Your working memory, which was already compromised by the general stress of the defense, shrinks even further. And here's what makes it worse. You start having what I call meta thoughts. You're not just trying to answer the question, you're also thinking, I should know this. Why don't I know this? I look unprepared. They're going to think I don't belong here. I'm failing right now in front of everyone. These meta thoughts, these thoughts about not knowing, consume cognitive resources you desperately need for actually processing the question and constructing a response. You're using your limited mental bandwidth to panic about the fact that you don't know, which makes it even harder to think through what you do know or how you might approach the situation and the question. This is the spiral most students face. This is why "what if they ask something I don't know" creates so much anxiety, because it's not just about one question, it's about the potential cascade that follows. But here's something important you need to understand. Your committee doesn't expect you to know everything. They're not trying to catch you in some gotcha moment where not knowing one answer means you fail your defense. They know your research has boundaries. They know there are methods you didn't use, analyses you didn't run, literature you haven't read, angles you didn't explore. What they're actually evaluating is how you handle not knowing. Can you think on your feet when challenged? Can you acknowledge limitations without falling apart? Can you engage thoughtfully with questions even when you don't have a prepared answer ready? Your response to not knowing tells them more about your readiness as a scholar than having memorized answers to every possible question. A defensive, panicked, or evasive response signals this person can't handle intellectual challenge or uncertainty. They're not ready for independent scholarly work. A thoughtful, honest, engaged response signals this person can think critically, acknowledge limitations, and engage with ideas beyond their immediate expertise. They're ready to be a colleague. So let me give you your most powerful tool for this moment, the pause. When you don't immediately know the answer, your instinct will be to fill the silence, to say something, anything, to avoid that uncomfortable moment of just standing there not responding. Resist that instinct. Instead, pause. Take an actual breath. 3 to 5 seconds of silence while you think. This works for several reasons. First, it gives your prefrontal cortex time to process. When you're under stress, your thinking is slower. Your cognitive processing takes more time. If you force yourself to respond immediately, you're responding before you've actually thought. The pause gives your brain the seconds it needs to access information and start constructing a response. Second, it signals confidence rather than panic. Immediate word vomit, just starting to talk with no clear direction, hoping you'll figure out your answer as you go, that signals anxiety and lack of control. A calm, deliberate pause signals, I'm thinking about this seriously. I'm not just reflexively defending myself. I'm actually considering your question. Third, the pause activates your parasympathetic nervous system. When you take a deliberate breath during that pause, you're engaging your vagus nerve, which signals to your amygdala, we're okay. We're not running from a predator. We have time to think. We can calm down slightly. Practice this right now. Out loud, say, that's a great question. Let me think about that for a moment. Then actually pause. Count 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It will feel long to you. That's completely normal. 5 seconds of silence feels like an eternity when you're the one standing there. But it's not too long. It's appropriate, reasonable thinking time before responding to a complex question. Now, let me give you several effective response strategies you can use depending on the situation. First, the honest acknowledgement. Sometimes you genuinely don't know the answer. The question is outside your scope, or it's about literature you haven't read, or it involves a method you didn't use. In those cases, say so clearly and directly. I haven't explored that specific angle, or that's outside the scope of this study, or I'm not familiar with that particular framework. This works because it's honest, it's direct, and it doesn't try to fake expertise you don't have. Your committee can tell when you're trying to bluff your way through an answer. They've been scholars for decades. They've heard every version of a student trying to fake knowledge they don't have. Attempting to bluff your way through damages your credibility far more than honestly acknowledging the limitation does. But, and this is critical, don't stop there. Follow the acknowledgement with engagement. I haven't read that specific paper, but based on what you're describing, it sounds like it addresses participant motivation. How does their approach differ from self-determination theory? You're acknowledging you don't know that particular work, but you're engaging with the broader concept, making connections to frameworks you do know, and asking an intelligent follow-up question. Second, the scope boundary response. Many questions can be addressed by clearly stating your research boundaries. That's outside the scope of this study. I focused on undergraduate populations rather than graduate students. But if I were to extend this work, that would be an interesting direction because the developmental stages differ significantly. This works because it shows you made deliberate choices about your research scope. You're not saying, I don't know. You're saying, I made a specific informed choice to focus here rather than there for these reasons. It demonstrates you understand research design, that you made thoughtful decisions about what to study and what to leave for future work. Third, the thinking out loud technique. When you need to think through a complex question, bring your committee along in your thought process. Here's how it goes. Let me work through this out loud. First, I need to consider the measurement issues, which would depend on whether we're looking at self-report or behavioral data, and that raises the question of validity concerns. So my initial thought is we could approach this through X framework, though I'd want to explore Y before being confident in that answer. This works because it shows your analytical process. Even if you don't arrive at a perfect, polished answer, you're demonstrating that you can think critically, identify relevant considerations, and reason through complex problems. You're showing them how you think, not just what you know. And for a doctoral defense, or even thesis defense, how you think matters as much as, sometimes more than, what you know. Fourth, the pivot to related knowledge. When you don't know the specific thing they asked about, connect it to something related that you do know about. Here's how it goes. I'm not familiar with that particular study, but the broader question you're raising about measurement validity relates to something I did explore in my pilot work. When I was developing my survey instrument, I found that, etc. This shows you can make connections, think broadly about your topic, and engage with questions even when they're not precisely what you prepared for. You're not dodging the question, you're bringing relevant knowledge to bear on the broader issue they're raising. Now, let me address a particularly anxiety-inducing scenario when you realize you made an error. Your committee points out something you got wrong, a calculation error, a logical flaw in your argument, a misinterpretation of your data. Don't get defensive. Don't try to justify the error or explain why you made it or minimize its importance. Say clearly and directly, you're right, I see the error now. Then address what it means for your work. That miscalculation would affect the estimates in Table 3. The direction of the relationship still holds, but the magnitude is smaller than I reported, for example. This works because it shows intellectual honesty and the ability to think critically about your own work. Scholars make errors. Everyone makes errors. What distinguishes good scholars from poor ones isn't making zero errors, it's whether you can recognize them when they're pointed out, acknowledge them honestly, and think through their implications for your conclusions. Defending an error you clearly made, trying to argue that it's not really an error or doesn't really matter, that damages your credibility. It signals this person can't handle being wrong. They'll defend flawed work rather than improving it. Acknowledging the error honestly and thinking through its impact demonstrates scholarly maturity. It signals this person cares about getting it right more than appearing infallible. Now, let me give you 3 practical techniques you can use right now to train these responses. First, practice the pause physically. Stand up right now if you can. Ask yourself a challenging question about your research, something you don't have a smooth, prepared answer to. Then practice saying out loud, "That's a great question. Let me think about that for a moment." Pause. Actually count 5 seconds. Take a breath, then respond with whatever comes to mind. Do this 10 times with 10 different questions. You're training your body to pause instead of rushing to fill the silence. The pause needs to feel normal, not uncomfortable. It needs to be an automatic response, not something you have to force yourself to do while your amygdala is screaming at you to say something immediately. Repetition makes it automatic. Second, write out your scope boundaries explicitly. Take 15 minutes. Actually set a timer for 15 minutes and write clear, specific statements about what your research does and doesn't cover. What population did you study, and why did you choose that population? What methods did you use, and what methods exist that you didn't use? What questions does your work answer, and what questions remain for future research? What are the acknowledged limitations? Having these boundaries clear in your mind, not just vaguely understood, but explicitly articulated in writing, means you can state them clearly and confidently under pressure. You're not trying to construct the explanation in the moment while your working memory is compromised and your threat response is activated. You've already done the cognitive work of articulating these boundaries. Now, you're just retrieving preformed statements. Third, practice the honest acknowledgement out loud. Say these phrases 10 times each so they feel natural coming out of your mouth. I haven't explored that angle specifically. That's outside the scope of this study. I'm not familiar with that particular work. You're right, I see the error now. These phrases feel uncomfortable the first time you say them because they feel like admissions of failure, like you're exposing yourself as inadequate. But they're not. They're honest, scholarly engagement. They're what competent scholars say all the time. Practice saying them until they feel natural, until you can deliver them without your voice shaking, without apologizing after, without feeling you need to explain or justify yourself. Let me give you the overall recovery pattern you can use when you don't know an answer. First, pause. Take a breath. Give yourself 3 to 5 seconds of thinking time. Don't rush to fill the silence. Second, acknowledge clearly. If you don't know, say so. If it's outside your scope, state that. If they're right about an error, acknowledge it. Third, engage anyway. Connect to related knowledge you do have. Think out loud about the question. Ask a clarifying question that shows you're engaging with the concept. Discuss implications even if you don't have the specific answer they asked for. Fourth, move forward. Once you've addressed it, you're done with that question. Don't keep apologizing or returning to it. Don't let it shake your confidence for the rest of the defense. You've handled it appropriately. Now move on to the next question with the same confidence you had before. This pattern works because it's honest, it demonstrates critical thinking, and it shows you can handle uncertainty and challenge without falling apart. Your committee isn't looking for perfection. They're not expecting you to have every answer to every possible question memorized and ready. They're looking for scholarly capabilities and resilience, the ability to think on your feet, acknowledge limitations honestly, and engage thoughtfully even when you're outside your comfort zone. Here are some example responses that demonstrate these techniques working together. Here's the first one. I haven't read that specific paper, but based on what you're describing, it sounds like it addresses participant motivation. How does their approach differ from self-determination theory? So honest acknowledgement plus engagement plus intelligent follow-up question. Here's another. That's outside the scope of this study. I focused on undergraduate populations rather than graduate students. But if I were to extend this work, that would be an interesting direction because the developmental stages differ significantly. So this provides scope boundary plus forward-looking engagement. Here's another. You're right. That miscalculation would affect the estimates in Table 3. The direction of the relationship still holds, but the magnitude is smaller than I reported. This shows direct acknowledgement of error plus thoughtful analysis of implications. These responses show what good scholarly engagement looks like when you don't have the perfect answer prepared. Now, here's what these techniques don't replace. These techniques help you manage the moment when you don't know an answer. They give you tools for staying composed, thinking clearly, and engaging thoughtfully even when you're caught off guard. That's extremely valuable. These are skills you definitely need. But they work best when you've trained them under pressure, when you've practiced the pause while your heart is actually racing, when you've delivered the honest acknowledgement while your threat response is genuinely activated, while you're feeling that physical sensation of being evaluated and found wanting, when you've thought out loud through different questions while experiencing real uncertainty about whether your response is good enough. Reading about these techniques is useful. Understanding the logic behind them helps, but your nervous system needs to have practiced them in conditions similar to your defense, not just rehearse them in your head or practice them in calm moments with supportive people, but actually executed them while under stress. The difference between what to do and being able to do it when pressure hits comes down to one thing: training your nervous system to execute these techniques in conditions similar to your defense. Not just rehearsing them in your head, but practicing them while under genuine stress, while your amygdala is firing, while your working memory is compromised, while you're experiencing real evaluation. That's the missing piece for most students. And in the final module, we're going to talk about what that kind of training actually looks like and how you can get it before your defense.